The vultures wheeled overhead, their shadows slicing through the pale dawn of Oak Valley, New Mexico, in the summer of 1880. Silas the Silent Thorn spotted them from a quarter-mile out, black specks spiraling against the scorched sky, riding thermals that quivered in the relentless heat. Their patient dance was a grim herald, one Silas knew too well. 3 years prior, those same carrion birds had guided him to a scene that still haunted his nights of massacre in the Chihuahuan desert, where his cavalry unit had raised a Cheyenne camp under false orders. The faces of the fallen, men, women, and children, lingered in his mind, their eyes accusing him in dreams. That day, he'd sworn to never again raise a hand against the innocent, trading his saber for solitude in a weathered cabin on the edge of Oak Valley. The memory struck him like a fist to the chest as he urged his gray mare, Dust, toward the ancient oak grove at the valley's heart. Through the heat's shimmer, a shape emerged, twisting in the dawn light, a figure dangling from the tallest oak, arms stretched taut above her head, long black hair falling like a mourner's veil across her face. She was alive, her faint struggles stirring the still air. A crude wooden sign was nailed to the gnarled trunk below her, its message scrawled in blood that had dried to a rusty brown. "The white man makes the rules." Dust snorted, her ears flicking back, nostrils flaring at the scent of blood and fear. The girl, barely more than a child, no older than 18, hung from coarse rope that bit into her wrists, red rivulets staining the bark beneath her. Her buckskin dress was torn, her shoulder gashed deep, the blood soaking into the earth like an offering. Silas's breath caught, his calloused hands tightening on the reins. The sight was a mirror to his past sins, a brutal echo of the lives he'd failed to save. His jaw clenched, and a familiar anger simmered in his chest, not at the girl, but at the cruelty that had strung her up like a trophy. Hey, if you're hooked on cowboy love stories with a twist of redemption, drop a 1 in the comments for Wild West love mysteries. Her breath came in shallow gasps, sending tiny puffs of dust swirling from her cracked lips. When she heard his approach, her eyes opened dark, intelligent, filled with pain but not defeat. The look she gave him held a terrible knowledge. She knew what white men did to Cheyenne. Women knew that rescue might be a crueler fate than death. But in those eyes, Silas saw the faces of the fallen from his cavalry days, Cheyenne women, their defiance unbroken even as his unit burned their homes. The boot prints around the tree told their own story. Multiple riders, some tracks heading back toward Oak Valley's dusty streets. Others circled, as if the perpetrators had lingered to savor their handiwork. Fresh tracks, maybe hours old. They could still be watching from the jagged rocks above. As he cut the ropes, her voice came a broken whisper in Cheyenne, raw and fleeting. Her strength gave out before the words could form, and she collapsed into his arms like a wounded bird, unconscious but breathing. Behind them, carried on the desert wind, came the distant thunder of hoofbeats. The hunters were already coming. Oak Valley had never been kind, but 3 years of Cheyenne troubles had turned it into something resembling hell. The frontier town crouched in the desert, like a wounded animal, all boarded windows and suspicious glances, where a man's worth was measured by his willingness to kill the right enemies and hate the right people. Silas Thorne had failed both tests. It started when he'd refused to join the first posse after the Cheyenne raids began. Cattle stolen from ranches, supply wagons ambushed on mountain trails, settlers found dead in their burned cabins. Most of Oak Valley had answered Mayor Caldwell's call to righteous warfare with fervor, forming volunteer companies to hunt Cheyenne with the zeal of men chasing demons. But Silas had seen enough killing in his cavalry days, had learned too much about how truth became the first casualty of righteous fury. The Cheyenne massacre he'd witnessed 3 years ago had taught him that lesson in blood, that not every enemy was what they seemed, that sometimes the real monsters wore familiar faces. "Mr. Thorne," Deputy Amos had said after the third posse rode out without him, "folks are starting to wonder whose side you're on." "The side of not shooting folks without proof they've done wrong," Silas had replied, his voice steady as iron. "Cheyenne don't need to do wrong, they just need to be Cheyenne." That conversation had been 6 months ago, July 1879. Since then, Silas's few friends had dwindled, his trading dried up, and the townsfolk had made it clear that Cheyenne sympathizers weren't welcome in decent society. Now, as he laid the unconscious Ilara on his kitchen table and began cleaning her wounds, Silas wondered if he was about to make himself an outright enemy of everyone he'd ever known. The torture had been systematic. Professional cigarette burns arranged in precise patterns, cuts tracing older scars, bruises speaking of calculated brutality. Someone had taken time with her, had used pain as a language to send a message as clear as the sign on the oak. The white man makes the rules. Easy, he said softly as Ilara stirred, her eyes fluttering open. The fear in them was absolute, primal, the terror of prey caught too many times. I won't hurt you. She didn't understand English, but something in his tonea, low, steady cadence, like a river smoothing stone, made her stop fighting. Instead, she studied his face with those intelligent dark eyes, reading intentions in the lines of his weathered features, the scars on his knuckles. Silas, he said, pointing to himself. Ilara, she whispered, her voice a broken thread. Recognition flickered in her eyes. She knew the name. The white rancher who wouldn't ride in poses, who refused to pay Cheyenne bounties. In a territory where such defiance marked a man as either coward or traitor, his reputation had spread beyond the settlements. She tried to sit up, gasped at the pain, and fell back against the pillow he'd arranged. The effort reopened, cuts on her shoulder, fresh blood staining the bandages, red as the dawn that had greeted her suffering. A knock at the door made them both freeze. Mr. Thorne. Deputy Amos's voice carried the weight of official business, sharp and unyielding. Need to talk. Silas quickly threw a blanket over Ilara, arranging it to look like piled supplies. From the doorway, it might pass casual inspection. "Comin'," he called, wiping blood from his hands, his heart pounding like a war drum. Amos stood on the porch, hat in hand, looking like a man bearing a bitter duty. Before his wife's death in a Cheyenne raid, he'd been known as fair, even kind. Now grief had hardened him into something sharper, more brittle, his eyes like flint ready to spark. "There's been trouble," Amos said. "Cheyenne girl escaped custody yesterday. Killed 2 men doing it. We're checking all the ranches." "What's she look like?" Silas asked, his voice neutral, though his pulse quickened. "Young, maybe 18, dark hair, about so tall." Amos held his hand level with his shoulder. "Name's Ilara, though that might be made up." Silas kept his expression blank, his gray eyes unreadable. "Haven't seen anyone like that." Amos's gaze narrowed, searching for a lie. "Mind if I take a look around? Just being thorough." "Of course not," Silas said, stepping aside, his hand resting lightly on his revolver, a silent vow to protect the girl who'd stirred his long-buried conscience. The desert wind howled outside, carrying the distant hoofbeats closer, a reminder that in Oak Valley, truth was a fragile thing, easily crushed beneath the white man's rules. They moved through the cabin, Deputy Amos's eyes cataloging details: the basin of bloody water, the medical supplies scattered on the scarred oak table, the blanket bundle that might hold provisions or conceal something far more dangerous. "Been slaughtering chickens?" Amos asked, his voice sharp, like a blade testing for weakness. "Rabbit for dinner," Silas replied, gesturing toward the blanket, his tone steady as the desert stone. "Meat's wrapped up there." His gray eyes held Amos's, unyielding, a silent challenge wrapped in calm. For a heartbeat, Amos's hand drifted toward his revolver, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Then he shook his head, his flinty gaze softening, just a fraction. "I believe you, Thorne," he said, though his voice carried a weight of doubt. "But this Cheyenne girl, she's different, dangerous." "How so?" Silas asked, his voice low, steady, like a river smoothing over jagged rocks. "I saw what she did to those men," Amos said, his voice trembling with a horror that seemed to age him. "Cut 'em up while they were still breathing, took pieces as trophies. That ain't human behavior." The words hung heavy, like smoke in the still air of the cabin, a grim echo of Oak Valley's fear. After Amos left, his boots crunching on the dusty path back to town, Silas returned to find Ilara watching him with those knowing eyes, dark and intelligent, like a hawk sizing up its perch. The firelight danced across her face, highlighting the bruises that still bloomed purple beneath her skin, the cuts that traced older scars. "You didn't tell him," she said in careful English, her voice raw but clear, a surprise that caught Silas off guard. "You speak English," he said, his brow furrowing, his hands still stained with her blood from tending her wounds. "Some," she replied, her lips twitching in a faint, pained smile. "My grandfather taught me." She struggled to sit up, her breath hitching as pain lanced through her shoulder, but her eyes never left his, searching for the lie beneath his weathered exterior. "Why didn't you tell?" It was the question Silas had been wrestling with since cutting her down from that oak on the 7th of July, 1880, in the brutal dawn of Oak Valley. "Because I don't think you killed those men," he said, his voice rough with truth, like sand grinding against stone. "Torture like what was done to you takes hours. You couldn't have killed anyone and then strung yourself up for someone to find." "For mate." Ilara studied him, her gaze measuring his sincerity against a lifetime of broken promises and betrayed trust. The fire crackled, its warmth a fragile comfort in the desert night, casting their shadows as one against the cabin's walls. "The deputy believes I did it," she said, her voice low, bitter, like a wound reopening. "Amos believes what he's been told to believe," Silas replied, his eyes fixed on hers, a steady anchor in the storm of her pain. He looked at this young woman broken, tortured, left to die, branded a killer without trial or evidence who embodied everything Oak Valley feared about the Cheyenne. "I believe people deserve a chance to tell their story." For 6 days, Ilara battled fever and infection, while Silas fought his own demons. Every time he cleaned her wounds or spooned broth between her cracked lips, he saw the faces of the Cheyenne women from his cavalry days, their eyes accusing him across the years. Another dark-haired woman he'd failed to save, another life crushed by the white man's rules. On the 7th day, the 14th of July, 1880, she woke with clear eyes and asked for water. "How long?" Her voice was stronger now, a thread of steel beneath the pain. "A week, give or take," Silas said, helping her sit up, noting how she moved with less wince, her body knitting itself back together like the desert after a storm. "You're a fighter, huh?" "I have to be," she said, accepting the tin cup with steady hands, her fingers brushing his, a fleeting warmth in the cool morning air. "Tell me about the men who died." Silas had spent the week gathering whispers from Oak Valley's saloon and market, piecing together the official story and its jagged edges. "According to the reports, you were being moved from the reservation to Santa Fe for trial," he said, his voice low, careful, like a man stepping through a minefield. "Wagon got hit outside town. 2 guards killed. You escaped into the desert." "That's a lie," Ilara said, setting down the cup, her hands trembling not from weakness, but from the effort of reliving trauma. Her eyes darkened, like a storm gathering over the horizon. "My grandfather was Walks, in shadow, a peace chief who still believed white promises about the reservation." Her voice grew bitter, a blade honed by loss. "He decided to take us to Mexico when the starvation got too bad." "Leh." Silas leaned forward, his hands clasped, the scars on his knuckles catching the firelight. Her words were a mirror to his past, reflecting the Cheyenne families he'd seen driven from their lands, their hopes crushed under cavalry boots. The cabin seemed to shrink, the walls closing in with the weight of their shared pain, the fire a silent witness to a truth Oak Valley had buried beneath its rules. Ilara's gaze held his, a flicker of trust breaking through her fear, like a star piercing the desert night. Silas felt it too, a spark of redemption, a chance to right the wrongs he'd carried for too long. New Mexico heat lingered even after dusk, pressing against the cabin's walls like a living thing. Ilara lay on the cot, her dark hair splayed across the rough blanket, her breathing steadier but still fragile, like a bird testing broken wing. Her wounds were healing, the gash on her shoulder now a dull ache beneath Silas's makeshift bandages, but her eyes sharp, intelligent, and haunted told a deeper story. They carried the weight of loss, a mirror to the guilt that gnawed at Silas's soul. Silas sat by the fire, his calloused hands carving a small wooden figure eagle, its wings half-formed, a task to keep his restless thoughts at bay. The desert night hummed outside, crickets chirping in rhythm with the stars that looked down on Oak Valley, unblinking witnesses to its sin. Ilara stirred, her gaze fixed on the flames, her lips parting as if to speak but hesitating, like a deer sensing danger. Silas didn't push her. He'd learned silence was sometimes the only way to coax truth from pain. "They came at dusk," she said finally, her voice low, raw with grief. "My family, we were heading to a new settlement, hoping for peace." Her words faltered, and Silas's hands stilled, the eagle's wings frozen mid-carve. The red spectersmen with masks, laughing like devils. They took everything, my pa's rifle, my ma's woven blanket, my little brother's. Her voice broke, and she clutched the blanket, her knuckles whitening. They left me hanging to warn others. One had a tattoo of a bull's head on his wrist. I'll never forget his eyes. The memory hit Silas like a bullet, sharp and unyielding. He saw it again, the Cheyenne camp 3 years ago, flames licking the sky, his cavalry unit following orders to clear the hostiles. The screams of children, the blood pooling in the sand, the orders he'd obeyed without question. His hands tightened around the carving knife, the blade trembling. Ilara's story was a knife to his heart, twisting with every word. He'd been part of that machine once. The white man's rules that crushed lives like hers. "I know that kind of pain," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper, barely audible over the fire's crackle. He set the knife down, the eagle unfinished, its wings a silent plea for freedom. "I was a cavalryman, Ilara. Rode with men who thought they owned this land. We burned villages, Cheyenne, Apache. Didn't matter. Orders were orders." His jaw clenched, the words tasting like ash. "I saw families die, kids. I didn't pull the trigger every time, but I didn't stop it neither." Mao. Ilara's eyes widened, a flash of betrayal crossing her face, like a storm cloud over the desert. "You?" she whispered, her voice sharp with accusation. "You were one of them?" Her body tensed, as if ready to bolt, but the cot held her, her wounds a cruel tether. The firelight painted her face in gold and shadow, her dark eyes blazing with a mix of rage and hurt, like a wounded animal cornered by its own trust. "I was," Silas admitted, his gaze fixed on the flames, unable to meet hers. "I ain't proud of it. Left that life 3 years ago after a raid went wrong. Too many graves, Ilara. Too many I helped dig." His voice cracked, a rare fracture in his stoic facade, revealing the man beneath the scars. "I live out here to forget, to make right what I can. Ain't much, but it's all I got." The silence that followed was heavy. The fire's crackle a mocking chorus. Ilara's breath came in short, angry bursts, her hands twisting the blanket like she could wring the pain from her soul. "They took everything," she said again, her voice a bitter echo. "My brother was 10. He wanted to be a healer like our grandpa. They shot him like he was nothing." Her eyes glistened, but no tears fell, as if she'd cried them dry long ago. Silas's chest tightened, the weight of her loss pressing against his own. He saw his past in her words, the faces of those he'd failed to save. The desert outside seemed to listen, its vast emptiness a mirror to their shared scars. "I can't undo what's done," he said, his voice low, steady, like a river carving through stone. "But I can keep you safe. I owe that much." Ilara's gaze softened, just a fraction, like a crack in a frozen river. She studied him, her eyes tracing the lines of his weathered face, the scars on his knuckles, the eagle half carved in his hands. "Why should I trust you?" she asked, her voice a challenge, but softer now, searching for truth. "Because I ain't them," Silas said, his gray eyes meeting hers at last. "Not anymore. I'm trying to make right, same as you're fighting to survive." His words were a vow, forged in the firelight, a promise to the girl and to the ghosts of his past. The cabin seemed to shrink, the walls closing in with the weight of their truths. Ilara's shoulders relaxed, her hands loosening on the blanket. "My grandpa said family ain't just blood," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's who stands with you when the world's against you." Her eyes held his, a flicker of hope amidst the pain. like a star breaking through a storm. Silas nodded, the eagle in his hands catching the fire's glow, its wings a symbol of freedom yet to come. "Then let me stand with you," he said, his voice firm, a bridge between their wounds. "For your family, for mine." The fire crackled, its warmth a fragile comfort in the desert night. Ilara's gaze lingered on him, her hatred dulling into something new, not forgiveness, not yet, but a tentative trust, like a seed taking root in barren soil. Silas felt it too, a spark of redemption, a chance to heal the wounds he'd carried too long. The stars outside looked down on something different, a bond forming in the shadows of Oak Valley, where pain and hope entwined like the roots of the ancient oak. The sun hung high over Oak Valley, New Mexico, on the 7th of July, 1880, its relentless glare turning the dusty streets of the town into a furnace. Silas Thorne guided his gray mare. Dust, through the heart of the settlement, Ilara perched behind him, her arms clinging to his waist, her body tense as a drawn bowstring. 10 days had passed since he'd cut her down from the oak, and though her wounds were mending her shoulder now, a dull throb beneath fresh bandages, her eyes, sharp and haunted, scanned the town like a hawk sensing a trap. The air was thick with the scent of horse sweat and baked earth, the kind of heat that made tempers flare and secrets fester. Silas's weathered face was a mask of calm, but his gray eyes burned with a quiet vigilance, like a storm held at bay. He'd come to town for medicine, something stronger than his herbs to keep Ilara's fever at bay. But Oak Valley was no sanctuary. The townsfolk's stares cut like knives, whispers of savage and traitor slithering through the crowd as they passed the saloon, its bat-winged doors creaking like a warning. Ilara's buckskin dress, torn and blood-stained, marked her as an outsider, and Silas's presence beside her branded him a fool or worse. The memory of his cavalry days clawed at him, unbidden arrayed in 77, when he'd stood by as his unit drove Cheyenne families from their homes, their cries echoing in the desert night. He'd been a cog in the white man's machine, enforcing rules that crushed lives like Ilara's. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing against his chest as he tethered dust outside the apothecary. He glanced at Ilara, her dark hair falling like a veil across her face, her eyes fierce but fragile, like a flame flickering in a gale. "Stay close," he murmured, his voice low, steady, like a river carving through stone. Ilara nodded, her gaze darting to the crowd, her hands clenched into fists. She was no stranger to hatred, but the weight of so many eyes made her shoulders hunch, as if bracing for a blow. Silas felt it too, the town's judgment like a noose tightening around them both. Inside the apothecary, the air was heavy with the scent of laudanum and dried herbs. The clerk, a wiry man with a pinched face, eyed Ilara with disdain, his lips curling like a snake's. Before Silas could speak, a shadow loomed in the doorway, a burly man, one eye scarred shut, his red bandana marking him as one of the red specters. "Well, ain't this a sight?" he drawled, his voice dripping with menace. Silas Thorne, playin' nursemaid to a savage. His good eye raked over Ilara, lingering on her wounds, and a cruel smile spread across his face. "She's the one from the oak, ain't she? Shoulda let her swing." Ilara stiffened, her breath catching, her eyes flashing with the same primal fire Silas had seen that first dawn. Her hand twitched toward the knife at her belt, but Silas's arm shot out, a silent barrier. "Walk away, One Eye," he said, his voice cold as iron, each word a warning. The man laughed, stepping closer, his hand brushing the revolver at his hip. "Or what, Silent? You gonna play hero for a squaw?" The air crackled with tension, the apothecary's shelves looming like silent witnesses. Silas's hand moved faster than thought, his fist connecting with One Eye's jaw in a single, bone-jarring strike. The man crumpled to the floor, blood trickling from his lip, the room falling silent as a grave. The clerk gasped, and the crowd outside froze, their whispers dying like a fire snuffed out. Ilara's eyes widened, a mix of shock and gratitude flickering across her face, like sunlight breaking through a storm. "Get the medicine," Silas told the clerk, his voice steady, unyielding. "Now." The man scrambled to comply, shoving bottles into a sack. Silas turned to Ilara, his gaze softening, a silent promise in his gray eyes. "You're with me, Ain't nobody touching you. Liz. Ilara's breath hitched, her fingers loosening on her knife. For a moment, her hatred for the world that had taken her family wavered, replaced by a flicker of trust, fragile as a desert bloom. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. Why'd you do that? Risk your neck for me? Silas didn't answer right away, his eyes fixed on the street outside, where the crowd parted like a river around a stone. The memory of that Cheyenne camp burned in his mind, the screams of the innocent, the orders he'd followed blindly. Because I've seen what happens when good men do nothing, he said finally, his voice rough with truth, and I ain't that man no more. The square outside buzzed with tension as they stepped into the sunlight. Market stalls lined the dusty street, their ware-sacks of flour, bolts of calicoignord, as eyes followed Silas and Ilara. At the center, Market Caldwell stood, his tailored coat and polished boots a stark contrast to the town's grit. His smile was all teeth, like a coyote sizing up prey, but his eyes were cold, calculating. "Mr. Thorne," he called, his voice smooth as snake oil. "A word, if you please, about your guest." Silas's jaw tightened, his hand resting on his revolver. "She ain't your concern, Caldwell," he said, his tone flat, a challenge wrapped in calm. Ilara stood closer, her shoulder brushing his, her presence a quiet strength. Caldwell's gaze flicked to her, his smile faltering, like a crack in a dam. "The town's safety is my concern," he said, his voice sharp now. "Hand her over for questioning. We'll handle it proper." "Proper?" Silas's voice was a low growl laced with scorn. "Like that sign on the oak? The white man makes the rules? I ain't playing your game." He stepped forward, his shadow falling over Caldwell, a silent vow to protect what he'd sworn to save. The crowd held its breath, the air thick with the promise of violence. Ilara's hand grazed Silas's arm, a fleeting touch, but enough to ground him. Her eyes, once filled with hate, now held something new, a spark of belief, like a star piercing the night. "You don't have to fight for me," she whispered, her voice steady despite the fear. Silas met her gaze, his own reflecting a shared resolve. "I'm fightin' for what's right," he said, his words a bridge between their scars. "For you, for them we lost." The town seemed to fade, the whispers drowned by the fire in their eyes, a bond forged in defiance of Oak Valley's hatred, a step toward redemption in a world ruled by blood. The stars burned cold above Oak Valley, New Mexico. On the night of the 10th of July, 1880, their light faint against the inky sprawl of the desert sky. Inside Silas Thorne's cabin, the fire's glow flickered like a heartbeat, casting long shadows across the weathered logs. Ilara sat by the hearth, her dark hair catching the light like a raven's wing, her hands steady now, though her eyes sharp and haunted, still held the weight of her family's blood. Silas leaned against the table, his calloused fingers tracing the half-carved eagle, its wings, a silent prayer for freedom. The air was heavy with the scent of pine smoke and unspoken plans, the kind that could shift the fate of a town. Silas's clash with One Eye 3 days ago had rippled through Oak Valley like a stone in a still pond. Whispers of his defiance reached the ears of the few who dared to dream of justice. Martha, the gray-haired shopkeeper whose tattered apron hid a spine of iron, slipped into the cabin under cover of dusk, her steps quick and cautious. "Folks are talkin'," she said, her voice low, weathered by years of keeping secrets. "Some say you're a fool, Silas. Others say you're the only one with guts to stand up to Caldwell and his red specters." Her eyes flicked to Ilara, softening like a mother's closet. "They're scared, but they're listening." Ilara's gaze met Martha's, a spark of hope flickering in her eyes, like a star breaking through a storm. "They should be scared," she said, her voice steady but edged with fire. "Those men took my family. They'll take more if no one stops them." Her fingers tightened on the blanket, the memory of her brother's lifeless body, a wound that bled anew. Silas watched her, his chest tight with a familiar guilt, the echo of Cheyenne's screams from his cavalry days ringing in his ears. He'd been part of the machine that crushed lives like hers. But now, in this cabin, he saw a chance to mend what he'd broken. Martha set a small bundle on the table, papers, maps, and a list of names scrawled in her careful hand. "The Red Spectres ain't just outlaws," she said. "They're Caldwell's dogs doing his dirty work, robbing settlers, burning native camps, all to scare folks into selling land cheap. That old gold mine, out by Black Ridge, that's their hideout." Her words were a spark, igniting a fire in Silas's gray eyes. He unfolded the map, its creases worn like the lines on his face, and traced a path to the mine, a scar in the desert's heart. Alara leaned forward, her breath catching as she studied the map. "The man who killed my family," she said, her voice low, trembling with rage. "He had a bull's head tattoo on his wrist, called himself Dagger." Her eyes burned, a primal fire that made Silas's heart lurch, reminding him of the women he'd seen in razed villages, their defiance unbroken even in death. He wanted to shield her, to spare her the pain of vengeance, but he knew that fire was hers to wield. Martha's face paled, her hands trembling as she pointed to a name on the list. "Jeb Caldwell, alias Dagger, the mayor's brother," she whispered, her voice hollow like a wind through an empty canyon. "He's been running the Spectres for years with his brother's blessing. Folks suspected, but nobody dared speak it." The revelation hit like a thunderclap, a twist that turned Alara's grief into a blade, sharp and personal. Silas's jaw clenched, his fingers tightening on the eagle, its wings now a symbol of the justice they sought. "You sure?" Silas asked, his voice a low growl, each word heavy with the weight of what it meant. To take on Dagger was to challenge Caldwell, to tear down the white man's rules that had bloodied Oak Valley for too long. Martha nodded, her eyes fierce despite her age. "I've seen him, Silas. That tattoo, that laugh, it's him." Alara's breath hitched, her hands shaking as she traced the name on the paper, as if touching it could summon her family's killer. "He's why I'm still here," she said, her voice a mix of pain and resolve, like a river cutting through stone. "For my pa, my ma, my brother, I'll make him pay." Her words were a vow, echoing Silas's own silent promise to atone for his past. Silas met her gaze, his gray eyes reflecting her fire, a shared purpose forging a bond stronger than words. "We'll make him pay," he said, his voice steady, a vow carved in the ashes of his guilt. "But not alone. We need more than just us." He turned to Martha, his mind racing like a Mustang across the open plain. "Who else'll stand with us?" Martha named 3 others: a blacksmith, named Amos, whose son had been beaten by the Spectres; Clara, a saloon girl who'd overheard their plans; and Old Man Tate, a prospector who'd lost his claim to Caldwell's schemes. "They're scared," she said, "but they're tired of living under Caldwell's boot." "Your stand in town woke something in 'em, Silas." Her words were a spark, kindling a hope that Oak Valley could be more than a graveyard of dreams. The cabin's walls seemed to pulse with their resolve, the firelight casting their shadows as one, like warriors before a battle. Silas spread the map wider, his finger circling Black Ridge. "We hit the mine at night," he said, his voice low, strategic, like a general from his cavalry days. "Take 'em by surprise, pin Dagger and his men, get proof of Caldwell's hand in this. Then we call in the federal marshal." His plan was a rope thrown across a chasm, a fragile bridge to justice. Martha clasped Alara's hand, her grip firm despite her age. "You're not alone, child," she said, her voice warm like a hearth in winter. "We're with you." Alara's eyes glistened, her hatred softening into something new, not forgiveness, but a shared fight, a bond forged in the crucible of loss. Silas watched, his heart stirring with a hope he hadn't felt in years, like a seed breaking through barren soil. The stars outside looked down on Oak Valley, their light a silent promise that truth could outshine even the darkest rules. The moon hung low over Black Ridge, New Mexico, on the 12th of July, 1880, its pale light barely piercing the suffocating darkness of the desert night. The abandoned gold mine, a gaping wound in the earth, loomed like a beast crouched in wait. Silas Thorne led their small band: Alara, Martha, Amos the blacksmith, Clara the saloon girl, and Old Man Tate through the rocky scrub, their shadows blending with the jagged cliffs. The plan was simple but perilous. ambush the red specters in their lair, pin dagger, and secure proof of Caldwell's crimes for the federal marshal. Silas's heart pounded, not from fear, but from the weight of redemption, a chance to bury the ghosts of his cavalry days. Those Cheyenne faces' mothers, children, gunned down under his watch haunted him still, their screams a chorus in his mind. Ilara's presence, her quiet strength, was a tether, pulling him toward a purpose he'd thought lost. They crouched behind a boulder, the mine's entrance flickering with torchlight. The specter's laughter echoed, crude and careless, like coyotes before a kill. Ilara's breath caught, her hand tightening on the knife at her belt, her eyes fixed on the shadows within. "He's there," she whispered, her voice a low growl, raw with grief. "Dagger, I feel it." Her words were a blade, sharp with the memory of her family's blood, her brother's lifeless eyes staring at a sky that offered no mercy. The attack came swift as a desert storm. Silas fired first, his bullet shattering a lantern, plunging the mine's mouth into chaos. Amos and Tate charged, their hammers and rifles a thunderous rebuke to the specter's reign. Clara darted through the fray, her nimble fingers snatching papers from a cradlejars linking Caldwell to the raids. Martha, her gray hair gleaming in the moonlight, stood guard, her shotgun, a silent promise of defiance. The specters fought back, their bullets spitting sparks, but Silas moved like a shadow, his cavalry training honed to deadly precision. Ilara slipped through the chaos, her knife glinting like a fang. She found Dagger at the mine's heart, his bull's head tattoo stark against his wrist, his laugh a cruel echo of her nightmares. "You," she hissed, her voice a blade cutting through the din. Dagger turned, his eyes glinting with malice, like a snake sizing up prey. "The squaw from the oak," he sneered, drawing his blade. "You should have stayed dead." "Ilara, don't lose yourself to him," Silas shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos, a plea wrapped in command. She faltered, her blade inches from Dagger's throat, her breath ragged. The urge to kill was a wildfire, consuming her, but Silas's words were a cool rain, grounding her. She saw her brother's face, not in vengeance, but in Hopi Healer's dream of peace. With a cry, she disarmed Dagger, her knife slicing his hand, sending his blade clattering. She pinned him, her knee on his chest, her voice steady as stone. "Death ain't justice," she said. "Truth is." "Les." Silas bound Dagger's wrists, his hands steady despite the battle's toll. The ledgers were secured, proof of Caldwell's corruption in Clara's hands. The remaining specters fled, their courage broken like dry twigs. Silas and Ilara dragged Dagger to the mine's entrance, where the federal marshal summoned by Silas's earlier message waited with his deputies. Caldwell, summoned to the scene, arrived too late, his polished facade crumbling as the marshal clapped irons on him and his brother. The town's rules, written in blood, shattered under the weight of truth. Dawn broke over Oak Valley, the 13th of July, 1880, painting the desert in gold and red, like a promise reborn. The townsfolk gathered, their faces a mix of shock and hope, as Silas and Ilara stood before the ancient oak where she'd nearly died. The sign, "The White Man Makes the Rules," lay splintered at its base, a relic of a broken order. With Amos, Clara, Martha, and Tate, they planted a new oak sapling, its roots a silent vow to heal the land's wounds. Silas carved a stone plaque, his knife steady. "We remember the pain, we plant hope, justice will bloom."